We're live.
Hello, everybody. Bonjour à tous. Thank you for attending our session today about financial wellness and employment. This challenge area is a priority for Age Well, and for good reasons. One is that many older Canadians experience financial vulnerability because we, as we get older, are likely to experience financial abuse as we get dependent on others. And because ageism and other social barriers prevent older workers from finding and keeping jobs. Financial difficulties are also a common experience for family caregivers. So that's why we need to give it attention. And today I'm delighted to chair a session on that challenge area. I am Virginie Cobigo. I'm Associate Professor at the School of Psychology at the University of Ottawa. I'm also the Director of Open Collaboration for Cognitive Accessibility. Through my research program and the work that we do at Open, we aim to remove barriers to employment and financial wellness for Canadians of all ages with cognitive disabilities. And I am particularly interested in making workplaces and technologies cognitively accessible. So I can't wait to hear our speakers today, which I will introduce in a minute. But before, I would like to pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardian of the land where the University of Ottawa is located and which remains unceded. I also pay respect to all Indigenous people who call Ottawa home. And I am very grateful for all the opportunities of growth that this land has provided me since I immigrated to Canada a few years ago. So I am very pleased to introduce our speakers today. The first presentation is MCI at Work, the Adaptive Technological Strategies to Sustain Employment Among People with MCI or Young Onset Dementia in the Workplace. And MCI stands for Mild Cognitive Impairment. And this presentation will be made by Dr. Kristina Kokorelias from Magnaye Health and the University Health Network. Our second set of speakers are Golnaz Ghaderi from the University of Ottawa and Carol Holmes-Kerr, caregiver and a member of the advocacy group Mind the Gap. The third presentation, I Can Do It All, I Think, Building the Business Case in Support of Employed Caregivers, is from Andrew Magnaye and Choong Kim from the University of Alberta. We will have the pleasure to hear Marjorie Moulton, an Age Well older adult and caregiver advocacy committee member, who will comment on those three presentations at the end. Before I give the floor to our speakers, I would like to tell you a little bit how we are going to proceed. So first, we'll have the three presentations back to back with a 5-minute Q&A. And at the end, we'll have a general Q&A to try to give some a higher level to our conversation based on the three presentations. You are encouraged to post your questions using the Ask a Question box. You can find the Ask a Question at the bottom of the window. And please post your questions in English or French. I am fully bilingual and I can translate your questions if you would like to ask them in French. The session is being recorded and will be available for playback. You will find the link on Crowdcast or on the EPIC conference site. The EPIC conference has been running for a few days now, but tomorrow is the last day of the conference. So please make sure that you register for as many talks as possible or of interest to you. And I would like to draw your attention to the panel Bridging the Digital Divide, Equity in Aging, Health and Technology, that will be hosted by Age Well partner Myra, and followed by a Star Institute panel, Get Published. And finally, the EPIC conference closing will end the week. I encourage you to check out the Age Well EPIC conference webpage for additional details and registration information. So I think I've said everything I had to tell you. I'm just checking my notes here. And I would like now to invite our first speaker, Dr. Kristina Kokorelias, who received her PhD from the University of Toronto's Rehabilitation Sciences Institute and completed her postdoctoral training in implementation sciences and dementia with the St. John's Rehab Research Program at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center. Kristina is now the Senior Academic Coordinator for Magnaye Health and the University Health Network's Healthy Aging and Geriatric Program. Dr. Kokorelias, I will give you the floor now.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Allison, who will be sharing my slides today. So today I'll be sharing some work we're conducting over at the University Health Network entitled MCI at Work, Exploring Strategies to Sustain Employment Among People with Mild Cognitive Impairment and Dementia in the Workplace. Next slide, please. So dementia is a progressive neurodegenerative condition that involves a decline in cognitive functioning. And while we hear often a lot about dementia, we often don't hear as much about mild cognitive impairment. So mild cognitive impairment involves a little bit more subtle changes in memory, language, thinking, or judgment that exceed the expectations of normal aging. Little is known about the strategies individuals living with mild cognitive impairment or young onset dementia use to sustain employment following the onset of symptoms. As we continuously hear about the increased number of people with dementia, the increased number is also expected for mild cognitive impairment and early onset dementia, meaning more and more people across Canada will be working with these conditions. Next slide, please. So our research team, which we call MCI at Work, is an international program of research that examines the situation of people living and working with mild cognitive impairment and early onset dementia in Sweden, Finland, and Canada. It's an interdisciplinary team with backgrounds in implementation science, psychology, legal aspects, dementia and gerontology, as well as occupational therapy. Next slide, please. The study I'll be talking about today was informed by a literature review where we conducted a literature review about how family caregivers support individuals in employment who develop cognitive impairment. We used that interview to inform semi-structured interviews that we've conducted across Canada with people living with the condition or their family caregivers or colleagues. To date, we've had 14 interviews completed in Canada, 11 with lived experiences, 2 with family caregivers, and 1 with colleagues. And we largely asked them about their experiences with employment or supporting someone in employment. Next slide. So what did we find? The first large finding that we found was that workplace culture and the type of job someone was in really influenced their experience with accommodations received. So what we found is that while participants initially perceived that their cognitive impairment was probably work stress or aging, it probably wouldn't impact their work. However, as time went on, they realized that something was wrong. Specifically, they noticed that they could not complete particular job tasks, which made them seek out medical care and get the diagnosis. From there, we found that the type of job and the workplace culture influenced whether accommodations could be made to help them receive support or not. And I'll elaborate on these in the upcoming slides. Next slide, please. What we found is that participants were largely concerned around financial stability, especially as they worked towards preparing for the future. It seemed like as soon as they got the diagnosis of MCI or early onset dementia, the planning began. Financial stability was largely a concern because there was no assistance for them in applying for long or short-term disability. Participants described that they didn't even know if dementia counted as a disability or how that would impact their pension programs if they retired early. As a result, we noted lots of themes related to worry and stress. People were concerned that they would either lose their job or that they couldn't find a new or suitable career, especially for those who had spent many years in the same workplace. They weren't even sure what the job market would look like. Individuals described having to learn and deal with their newfound disability and were really concerned that they could not predict the future, particularly what would happen to them and their careers. Next slide, please. We found that people coped in one or two ways. The first was self-adapted accommodations. Because people could not actually get accommodations through their work, they started finding their own solutions. This included things like using paper and pencil, notebooks, sticky notes, or even fellow colleagues to remind them of various tasks. They often had a unique style of how they used their various accommodations and often described that this was different from what they used before. For example, one participant really talked to us about how they used to be able to do everything electronically, including keeping up with their calendar and to-do list, but now had to resort to using a pen and found that worked. They all adapted and noted that it was important that whatever they used to help cope was highly visible to them. Some people also turned to the opposite and started using technology more. This included things like using their smartphone, their iPad, timers, etc. And they really recommended that as we look to develop technologies to support them in the workplace, that we were sure that they were inclusive, that they can provide clear feedback and ensure that it was customizable and flexible to their needs. They also described that whatever technology they used or would use would have to be minimal distractions and to support them without needing much help. So they didn't want a technology that they would need someone to train them to use. Next slide, please. We also noted some findings around perceptions of support. Participants who were living with dementia or mild cognitive impairment described that the support from the employer towards actual accommodations differed. Some employers were really outgoing and able to accommodate, whereas others did not. And they really wanted that tangible support. So in situations where the employer was not supportive, they really resented that. Participants also wanted emotional support. They really wanted their employer and their colleague to help them manage their illness, overcome challenges, and just keep the positive relationship that they always had. They also wanted feedback from their employer on work performance and accommodations. Participants often talked about that sometimes they wouldn't know if they were facing challenges, and so they would have liked to receive that feedback so that they would know how they are doing and perhaps where they needed a little bit more help. And lastly, they described wanting informational support. So this was information about directly obtaining information about MCI or dementia and what accommodations they could get. Unfortunately, most participants described needing to figure this out on their own, even after they talked to their doctor. Those who had previous positive relationships were more likely to have more support and therefore better accommodations. People believe that if you had a better relationship in your workplace, you would be quote unquote better off. For the few caregivers or care supports that we interviewed, we noted that they supported individuals, but it became a challenge for them to balance their own jobs, their caregiving duties, and paid employment and or education. None of them described actually using technology to help them balance their various roles. Last slide, please. So what does all this mean? As we work ahead with our MCI at Work team and our future projects, these results help us highlight the current and adaptive use of technology and other supports by people with mild cognitive impairment or early onset dementia. And so by understanding how these people are currently adapting and using technologies as they continue to strive to maintain their employment, we can make some recommendations that other people can use if they ever find themselves in a situation where they need to support someone with MCI or dementia in the workplace. We also note that future research could consider technology that can support caregivers sustain meaningful occupations, as right now we found that caregivers often face challenges balancing their roles and don't use technology. This work, like most research, has to be considered in the context of their strengths and limitations. So while we're getting the perspectives of multiple stakeholders, including people with lived experiences, their caregivers and supporters in multiple countries, we must also consider that at this stage, we only have 14 interviews from Canada, and that the workplace context, which we found differs so very, could be really different across the globe. So we're hoping as we move along to continue to develop technology that's designed for everyone and to be inclusive of people with MCI and dementia in the workplace. Last slide, please. So with all that, I'd like to thank you all for listening. My contact information is on the screen, as is those of the primary investigator of the MCI at Work project, Dr. Alina Stell. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristina. We have 2 questions for you in the Ask a Question box. The first one is, did you see any cultural differences between the 3 countries?
Yeah, so what today I presented our work from Canada, but as I said, this work is being continued along Finland and Sweden. What we noted in particular was that there is different legal aspects that change across the jurisdictions. So for example, in Finland, it's more explicitly known that dementia is actually a disability, whereas here the rights or the laws governing that are very vague. We also noted that in our international countries, so in Finland and Sweden, people seem to have not as much of a barrier as seeking support. It was surprisingly less needed to actually state that you had dementia or MCI and say that you have a formal diagnosis. People just in those countries just talked about being able just to share that they were facing challenges and get support. Whereas here, people really talked about needing to say it was a medical diagnosis. And were participants asked to keep a daily log, diary, or journal during the involvement in the study? For the qualitative study, they were not. We basically asked open-ended questions and asked them about any supports that they use, which came up naturally. So we didn't actually ask, hey, what technology did you use? And then, are there any government policies or services to support or protect those in cognitive challenges in the workplace? So our research team is doing a whole nother study with some legal experts where we are looking at all the laws in Canada that help govern disability legislation, particularly for people with cognitive impairment. The short answer would be that in Ontario, at least, employers have the right to accommodation or the right to meaningful accommodation. And so that can really vary. So in the context of our work and their qualitative work, we found that depending on the organization, the supports varied. So a large organization with a huge budget, for example, might be able to provide different resources, such as a private laptop, an iPad, etc., that maybe a small mom and pop place could not, because they simply couldn't afford it. So there is legislation. An employer does have to help an employee up until the point of undue hardship, but that is left to interpretation.
I don't see any other questions in the Ask a Question box. Yes. Can you please give an example of undue hardship?
Yeah, so the legislation and our legal team who reviewed some case law where people actually sued an employer, it could really be defined as things such as financial hardship. So if the cost of keeping the employee. Another example would be people who work physical or manual labor jobs, or jobs where safety could be at risk. So people such as physicians providing medical care where judgment could be off and it could actually cause harm. Or if someone was doing a very mechanical job and they deemed it unsafe, that would actually put the employer in an undue hardship, and it might cost them a lot of money or risk legal lawsuits. So those are just 2 examples.
So now I don't see any more questions, but you will have an opportunity to ask other questions at the end to all of the panelists. Dr. Kokorelias, thank you very much. It's a very interesting study and highly needed. What I will remember from your presentation is that technologies need to involve, or technology developers need to involve persons with dementia and cognitive disabilities to really get to know what they need to better support them. And that's, I think, something that AgeWell has been pushing and arguing for a while. And the other thing is that the examples of accommodations that you gave are not that expensive and rarely complicated to implement. So it gives a lot of hope for those who might need accommodations, because it might be highly feasible to accommodate them in the workplace, at least at the beginning of the dementia and the onset of the symptoms. Thank you. So we'll then turn to the second presentation. The second presentation is from Golnaz Ghaderi. Golnaz is a fourth-year student in the clinical psychology program at the University of Ottawa under my supervision, so I know Golnaz a little. She has also obtained 2 master's degrees, one in developmental psychology and education from the University of Toronto, and one in applied psychology from Laurentian University. Golnaz has been involved in the field of intellectual and developmental disabilities for several years, and currently her PhD thesis is focused on the knowledge and perspectives of persons with intellectual disabilities and their support providers regarding financial abuse. With her research, Golnaz aims to inform strategies to prevent financial abuse prevention. We also had invited Carol Holmes-Kerr to co-present with us. Unfortunately, Carol is unable to attend today. Carol has lived experience as a caregiver. Around 2000, her husband began having cognitive disabilities and was diagnosed with dementia in 2008. As his dementia progressed, Carol began to take on many responsibilities that her husband could no longer fulfill. She cared for him at home until 2012, when he was admitted to long-term care. At that point, he could no longer read or use a telephone, follow a television show, or often forgot Carol's name and that she was his wife. Carol's husband died in 2013, and Carol helped us get testimonials and examples from other caregivers in her network regarding financial abuse and how technology might increase the risk of financial abuse or might be helpful when preventing financial abuse. So we'll share her thoughts and comments with you. But of course, she is not able to attend herself. So Golnaz, I will turn the mic to you.
Thank you, Virginie. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Virginie, for the introduction. Today, I'll be talking about can technology help prevent financial abuse? Next, please. So, according to the Government of Canada, financial abuse is defined as the illegal or unauthorized use of someone else's money or property. It includes pressuring someone for money or property. There are different types of financial abuse. So, explicit types of financial abuse includes theft or fraud, like stealing someone's money. And then we have implicit types of financial abuse, which includes pressuring, forcing, or tricking someone to, for example, sign a legal or a financial document that they do not understand. Next, please. Next slide, please. Okay. So research shows that one slide. Can you go back one slide, please? There you go. Thank you. So research shows that financial abuse is prevalent among older adults. Specifically globally, older adults, 15.7% of older adults experience abuse, all forms of abuse. From that 15.7%, 6.8% is financial abuse among those who live in community settings, and 13.8% is among those who live in institutional settings. So financial abuse is the most common form of abuse among older adults, especially those who have health crisis. For example, decline or impairment in their cognitive or physical functioning, or those who develop a dependence on their family members for care, or those who have poor health. But the problem is that in a lot of cases, it's underreported because oftentimes these older individuals may experience fear of, for example, losing support if they report the financial abuse, or saying no to the perpetrator. Can you please go to the next slide? So 20 to 40% of older adults have some form of cognitive disability. And cognitive disability is an umbrella term for disabilities like dementia, cognitive challenges that occur due to stroke, cancer, head trauma, or mental health conditions such as depression. Like some of these conditions may occur like during like adult years, or cognitive challenges due to intellectual and developmental disabilities that present themselves in developmental years. But given this high prevalence of cognitive disability among older adults, and as research shows, these individuals they're at risk of experience financial abuse, and financial abuse is prevalent, is the most prevalent form of abuse among these individuals. There's lack of research looking at this topic of financial abuse specifically among persons with cognitive disabilities, specifically intellectual disabilities. And therefore, if you can move to the next slide, please. My thesis aimed to examine the knowledge and perspectives of persons with mild intellectual disabilities and their support providers, paid support providers, about financial abuse. I recruited 12 individuals with mild intellectual disabilities. They age between 30 to 60 years, and 14 support providers, including directors, managers, social workers, support workers, basically those who work directly or indirectly with individuals with intellectual disabilities. These individuals participated in semi-structured interviews using vignettes. I presented them with different vignettes on different forms of financial abuse, explicit forms, implicit, and no abuse. And basically, after showing them the vignettes, I asked them to tell me about how they perceive the situations, and how they would react in such situations. I also gather some demographic information about whether they use credit card, debit card, ATM, and how they manage their finances, if they receive any help, whatnot. That's for people with intellectual disabilities. I analyzed my data, my first study, which is individuals with intellectual disability population, using thematic analysis to identify important concepts and extract meaningful interpretation in relation to my research objectives. I still haven't analyzed my second set of data, and with my first one I have some preliminary findings that I would like to share with you all. Please, next slide. So far what I've found, the preliminary findings have revealed that there are different factors impacting individuals' interpretation of vignettes as abusive or not. One is pattern of perpetrator's behavior. So one of my participants said, well, if she's okay to pay for a friend, that is okay. But if this becomes a regular thing, which speaks to the pattern of a behavior, and her friend never pays her back down the road, that might get to a problem someday. Another factor impacting individuals' interpretation is type of relationship between the victim and the perpetrator. So the one vignette was about a group home, an interaction that happened in a group home. So the participant said their role, meaning group home rules, you need to respect it. So you need to respect it. You need to respect that, no question. Another one is like when I asked individuals about how they manage their finances, their own personal experience was like, I go to bank teller to get some money. I can't use the bank machine. I don't know how to operate those. So now moving on to the stakeholders. As Virginie said, Carol unfortunately wasn't able to attend today, but she provided us with some very valuable information about her experience and 6 other caregivers' experiences and concerns regarding financial abuse. And not just abuse, is financial abuse and financial management or challenges that they witnessed among elderly individuals with dementia. Next slide, please. So some of these common experiences is one of them is online credit card use and abuse. So one of the caregivers mentioned that I found catalog companies had her mother's credit card on file, so she just needed to know her name to order. So the catalog company kept charging the mother until they had to let them know and stop the charge. Which it's like increased her risk because all she needed to know is just to put her name, and then the charges would take place on her credit card. Another one is charity solicitation by phone or online. So when individual said, I took over all financial matters such as paying bills. However, the solicitations carried on for years. It took a lot of effort to cut off those and knowing demands. Another experience was erratic bill paying. So one caregiver spoke about her husband who following dementia, he started withdrawing large amounts of money and paying the same bill multiple times. So which led to a lot of financial loss for him and the family. Next slide, please. Another one is a relative request to borrow money. One of the caregivers spoke about her witnessing a woman, someone else. A woman's husband had a niece who was a mutcher and called him at least once a week. So she even talked to the bank and had his account access blocked except with her approval. So that's how often they also get they're taken advantage of by family members. They may. And then the other common experience is difficulty understanding and using new technologies. So one caregiver said, he asked me, which refers to her husband with dementia, he asked me how the bank account worked. I tried to explain the additions and subtractions. I finally said, I don't understand it either. And one day, the husband with the dementia said he also had difficulty using the ATM and a teller helped him. So these speak to some of the challenges that individuals with cognitive disabilities or dementia experience using technology with for their day-to-day finances or managing their finances. Which and a lot of these individuals, they rely on other people's help or they rely on their caregivers' help, which also may increase their risk of experiencing financial abuse. So my question for you all is that next slide, please. How can technologies help prevent financial abuse? And thank you for listening to my presentation.
Thank you very much, Golnaz. I find Golnaz's thesis very rich and innovative because it gives us an opportunity to understand the complexity of the interpretation and the gray area around financial abuse, which is not an easy situation to understand, as there are many factors that play in the situation and its interpretation. So I find that analysis quite interesting. There is a first question for you, Golnaz, that is, how did you define mild intellectual disabilities? Is there a scale being used in the study?
That's a very good question. So how we defined it, we wanted to make sure that so intellectual disabilities is a very heterogeneous group. And we wanted to make sure that we're recruiting individuals. We wanted to make sure they're as homogeneous as possible, in a sense that the severity level, so that we're not wrongfully generalizing the findings of this study to other populations, other individuals with different severity of like support needs. So what we did for the purpose of my study is that we used behavioral indicators that was published by a study by Kogan and et al. I can share the study later on with you guys. So what they've done is that they've created a list of behavioral indicators that helps you use like go through, like, there are questions that you ask to assess the severity level in a way to use for the purpose of research. Especially they created these behavioral indicators for countries that they don't have access to, for example, some assessment tools like WISC or WAIS, so that at least they can help them to assess the severity of support needs using these questionnaires.
Thank you, Golnaz. The second question is, in one of your first slides, you present prevalence rates of financial abuse, and you distinguish those in a community setting and those in an institutional setting, and the prevalence rate is higher in institutional setting. Do you have an idea why?
I have my guesses. That was in meta-analysis. I have, based on my experience, and especially doing my thesis and working with these individuals and some organizations, I have my guesses. So what we notice is that individuals who live in institutional settings, a lot of times they have support workers or organizations helping them manage their money. And in some cases, especially with financial abuse, that there's like there's a lot of, it's not like really black and white. There's a lot of implicit case of financial abuse. So for some of them, they might be experiencing financial abuse due to by support providers, which can be intentionally or unintentionally, because again, there's a lot of gray areas, a lot of implicit cases, but they experience more cases of financial abuse because they have less autonomy and they're more dependent on receiving help and relying on support workers to help them. But again, that's my that would be my guess, and based on my own experience and what I know from other research. But great question.
By support workers, do you mean the institution staff?
By so support workers, I mean, yes, everybody, whoever works, helps and support individuals with intellectual disabilities. Yes, those would include support workers.
The last question for now is, are there any existing technologies or services that are available to help protect the financial interests of older adults with cognitive disabilities? Or do they have to rely on honest family and friends?
That's a very good question. And I was hoping that I would get your ideas or your knowledge to answer that as well. One thing that I've learned based on my very limited research regarding technology is I believe there are some companies that have created apps that in the US that if they basically flag individuals, for example, one of the examples, like the husband with dementia kept paying the same bill over and over. So in those situations, the app would flag or stop the payment. But I'm not sure about, I'm assuming there's a lack of technologies out there, given the lack of research on the topic in general. But I'll be more than happy to hear what you guys think, or if you guys have any ideas or know of any technologies.
I'm not aware of specific technologies either. And I would argue that what we need is not special technologies, but we need to make the technologies that everybody uses more accessible. Right. ATM machines, whatever we use in the stores to make transactions, and online banking in general, all that can be made more cognitively accessible, simpler to use, and have automatic checking systems to make sure that there are not multiple payments that seems to be a strange habit for the customer or things like that. I'm sure there is there are many ways to make all these systems more secure for customers and more accessible.
Exactly, and that is right. And something maybe not just specific to technology, but to the banking system. Maybe if there is awareness among the banking, like in the banking system, about this issue, and establishing a support for these individuals, maybe so that they can, if they have the ability, if they can rely on themselves or the bank rather than being so dependent on their caregivers. Maybe that would decrease some of the risk, because we know research shows that in over 90% of the cases of financial abuse among these individuals happens by people that are known to them. And that's explained partly because of really heavy relying on other support to help them with their day-to-day finances.
Thank you, Golnaz. I don't see any additional questions in the box, so I think we'll move on to the next presentation, and we'll have more time for the general Q&A at the end.
Okay, thank you.
So the next presentation is from Andrew Magnaye, who is a doctoral student from the Department of Human Ecology at the University of Alberta. The main focus of his research examines how family caregivers are combining their paid work in Canada and care responsibilities to older family members across national borders. He has also worked on research projects on how rural communities support people living with dementia and their caregivers, how technology plays a role in supporting family caregivers in the workplace, and the role that employers and policy environments have to play for the growing population of employed family caregivers in Canada. Choong Kim has graduated from the University of Wyoming with a master's degree in agricultural economics. During his graduate study, Choong became particularly interested in evaluating the economic impact of public policy related to aging after noticing optimization issues from the government agencies in both developed and developing countries. His career goal, and I hope he gets there because that's a very noble career goal, after completion of his PhD in Canada at the University of Alberta, is to join a global nonprofit organization related to economics of aging, such as the World Bank or the World Health Organization, so he can help seniors overcome poverty in developing countries. Andrew and Choong, I will turn the mic to you.
Thank you so much. And just to kind of set the context for our presentation, the title, I Can Do It All, I think, we tend to find that's the resounding sentiment with a lot of the caregivers that we speak to. Their lives are a constant schedule and to-do list of things that they have to run through and get through on a day-to-day basis just to keep afloat. And this presentation has a big focus on employed caregivers. So those who are also managing, the family care of someone, within their family with a chronic health condition or a long-term health condition, are also trying to juggle a full-time or a part-time job. So this little chart here that we kind of pulled from Statistics Canada, it shows that caregiving happens no matter how old you are. The red bars on the chart indicate the employment age range from about 19 years old to 70 years old. And you can see that there are caregiving is trending upwards across almost all of the age demographics. And of course, we know that caregiving is a very gendered phenomenon and women are more impacted by men. And you see very interesting findings, especially around the 25 to 34 to 35 to 44, kind of those ages where, people are starting to get their, paid work lives under them and really launching into the trajectories of their careers. And of course, there is that stigma that caregiving only happens in later life, but you see that, a lot of the prime caregiving or the highest proportions of caregivers across the ages does occur at this 45 to kind of 64, kind of your prime working years, when you're trying to work, you're trying to raise a family, build up a pension or build up, those benefits that you're going to accrue into your later years. But caregiving is something that is very ubiquitous. So I'm going to throw it over to Choong to speak a little bit more about our analysis.
Yeah, so in speaking with employers, some of the companies are reluctant to get behind caregiving because they don't know how to quantify care. And to quantify care, we're using Statistics Canada's General Social Survey, Cycle 32, on caregiving and care receiving, which is conducted in 2018. The survey collected a wide range of information about the provision and receipt of care to and from family members and friends or neighbors with long-term health conditions and or disability or aging-related difficulties. In the slides, you can see that the results show that there are a significant number of the employed caregivers across provinces, aged 19 to 70, in the Canadian labor force, 5.2 million caregivers estimated. Also, they provide significant amount of care as well. And you can see there's also the gender differences there as well, that woman tends to provide more hours of care compared to a man. Next slide. So these 5.2 employed caregivers across provinces have collectively contributed 30 billion hours of care. And if you multiply these hours by, for example, the $17, which is the national home support workers wage rate, then you'd get roughly $51.5 billion, which is a very crude figure and also probably lower than its true value of care, because in fact the value of individuals' time varies. But it still gives you the idea of the possible range of the value of care. Next slide.
Thanks so much, Choong, on speaking to our analysis of the GSS. And we know for a lot of people, some of those figures or some of those numbers are kind of hard to contextualize. So what we wanted to do with this presentation was also highlight some of our consultations with employers and specifically with employed caregivers about kind of their experiences navigating the paid labor force and also their family care responsibilities. So for the remainder of this presentation, we're going to speak about Wendy. And Wendy was such an awesome example of what it's like to really, strive to find the balance between both. She was a employed family caregiver, and by this quote, I'll just read it off. I worked in the banking industry for 28 years, but as my parents grew older and mom and dad required more assistance, work and care became extremely challenging to manage. I was in a management position at the bank, so expectations were very demanding. Eventually, I left the financial security I had with my job in the corporate world to have more flexibility as an entrepreneur. I think what we noticed from the previous two presentations is that gaining that individual insight onto these phenomena that we're actually studying is super important, because we want to make sure we don't lose any of the nuance when we're talking about findings or when we're talking about supports and actually trying to help these people in terms of what it is that they want to do, whether it's maintain their current jobs, find new employment that's a little bit more meaningful or a little bit more accommodating to their family care needs, or even finding employment that's a little bit more suited to their own health conditions or their own abilities, where they really can flourish and be themselves and be a good fit for them. Joe?
So the employed caregiver we spoke to is not alone in finding work and care difficult to manage. Sometimes employed caregivers have to take a time off work to take a loved one to appointments, cover for home support workers who don't show up as planned, for example, or to coordinate care when unexpected things happen. So these missed days of work add up. And as you can see in the slides, the results show that about 1 in 2 employed caregivers reported missing 1 or more full days of work due to caregiving. And employed caregivers on average miss 8.4 days of work per per year because of caregiving. And collectively, that's 15 million days of work per year missed because of caregiving. And so it shows that it's a significant amount of productivity loss in employers' perspective. That shows it's not an individual's issue. And so the next slide, please. So one of the popular strategies to respond imbalance between paid work and care is to reduce their paid work time. And on average, these employee caregivers work 11.7 fewer hours per week in 2018. And collectively, that's 312 million fewer hours per year. And if you divide by the full-time hours, for example, like the 35 hours per week and 52 weeks a year, then roughly you'd get 171,000 full-time employees employer would need to hire. So they can give you some idea of the scale of this productivity loss in employers' perspective. Next slide.
Yeah. And so when we spoke to Wendy, and she had mentioned that expectations are very demanding. Further in our interview, she reiterated that when I was at work, it felt like my mind was on a million things all at once. And there's actually a label to that kind of phenomenon, which the literature on work and care calls presenteeism, or being distracted at work. And in our analysis of the 2018 GSS, we found about 46%, so almost half of the employed caregivers, reported having difficulty at fulfilling work responsibilities because of family responsibilities. So that lingering feeling in the back of their head that, I have to be on call, my phone has to be on me. And 46% of the people within the survey answered that they at least sometimes, often, or always felt this kind of a distraction factor. And when we dove into a little bit more of the literature, we saw this was especially true in high achievers in the workplace. So people in upper management, people in more senior management, or higher held roles within the hierarchy of an organization, typically between the ages of 25 to 35. And if you guys remember that chart we brought up at the very start of the presentation, there was that kind of trend upwards for caregivers around that age, and who had senior executive titles or managed other managers. So the distractions that happen at work happen across, the job roles and the titles within the organization. And not only are you trying to figure out, can I make it to work because of something that might happen on the caregiving end of within my family, but once I'm there, am I just going to be worrying about it the entire time of my shift, or the entire time that I'm away from the person or persons who might need care?
So that the national survey on caregivers shows that the 6% of those employed caregivers in fact left the paid labor force because of caregiving in 2018. And obviously leaving the paid labor force has tremendous financial consequences for the caregiver and their families. But recent studies also have shown that the organizations get also hit hard trying to replace the skills and expertise of their employees who had to leave their jobs. Our employee caregiver had to make the difficult decision to leave a job and organization they were with for nearly 3 decades. And for example, that the Wendy we just showed, because the flexibility was not there to do what they needed for their mom or dad. So those who left the labor force and many of them not retired yet. So they're still looking for employment opportunities that better meet their skills and expertise in their chosen fields. So the Canadian society definitely needs to support those the caregivers who left the labor force to come back to the labor force later when they are ready to resume their work activities. And that's also the beneficial for the Canadian employers as well. Next slide.
Thanks, Choong. And I think, so we're going to bring up, My Matchwork, and it's a partner that we've been working with that is intended to help employers kind of understand what potential employees are looking for in terms of meaningful work, but also work that can cater to their skills. Because they, like us, we saw the gap in the people who were leaving the workforce because of paid work and care responsibilities. So they thought, why don't we take the time to actually ask and consult with people about what makes, what is meaningful work to them? What is it going to be that is required for a workplace to have, so that you can not only come here as yourself as an employee to fulfill the job that you have, but it also takes into account, your family care responsibilities and your, where you may have to be flexible at times, or where you may actually have to demonstrate some sort of flexibility in the working arrangements that you're going to have for your workplace. Because for Wendy, when we spoke with her, she felt like she had to choose. It was kind of an ultimatum. It was either I'm able to be there for my family, I'm able to be there for my parents, or I'm going to keep this job. And there was no kind of middle ground. And that's a really tough position to put people in. And for caregivers, it happens so often that apps like Matchwork and partnerships with them, they've showed us that we want to help people meet in that middle ground. And we have a little bit of a video that actually shows what they do, if we can just quickly show it.
I can taste I can taste I can taste words. I can taste I can taste
I hope everyone enjoyed the little music break. But I think from what the short video kind of shows is that, we do want to find caregivers meaningful work, and we don't want to have to make them have to choose. And in our consultations, with employer champions, so these are people who have actually went out of their way to speak to us because they saw that need within their workforce. And one particular employer champion, we want to end the presentation off here because we want to leave it on kind of like a ray of hope, like something to kind of build towards, is that one employer champion we spoke to, he saw that in his own company that a lot of his employees were struggling, work life and personal life. And this was even before the pandemic, right? So he wanted to come to work to be more empathetic. He wanted to be able to lead more at work, and he wants his employees to be able to bring their whole selves to work because he knows that leads to higher production, that leads to a better morale within the workplace, and just an overall better working experience for everybody involved. So to find those kind of employer champions, I think, is really that next step in being able to get employers to start supporting their caregivers in a way that isn't just lip service or isn't just a form of corporate social responsibility that they're kind of paced on a monthly basis, maybe on Caregivers Month in April, but something that they actually follow through on and work towards building with, their employed caregivers in the workforce. And that's all we have. So thank you.
Very much for your presentation. We have 2 questions in the Ask a Question box. Oh, 3, 4. Wow. How can we influence government or employers to economically and socially value caregivers? Are there policies that could be employed? Good luck with that question.
I think, and to be honest, that is like the $1 million question of almost like all of our work. It's how do we get the information, whether it's qualitative, quantitative, whether it's statistics, whether it's testimonials, how do we get them in front of the people within the workplaces and within organizations that can actually make a change? And we know this isn't going to be a wholesale change that an entire sector will adopt in one fell swoop. It has to come, like we said, with those employer champions who are already seeing kind of in the tea leaves how their workforce is being impacted by family care responsibilities, and understanding that if I support these people, they're going to work 10 times harder than me. That's what some of the employer champions told us. They said they got behind some of their employees who they knew were maybe struggling or were having difficulties in trying to juggle and balance their paid work and their care work. But even that knowledge of like knowing that, hey, my employer has my back. I'm going to go the extra mile for this guy. And I'm going to make sure that I, come with my full self to work and fulfill the job that I have. But again, on a one-to-one basis, that's going to be a slow crawl. And we know this. So, Choong, I don't know if you have anything to add.
In my opinion, that especially for policymakers, they want to quantify. I mean, they need to see the scale of caregiving and impact of caregiving in numbers, realistically. So, as some of the employers said in the slides, the government also wants to quantify care. So, I think the one of the things that the researchers need to do in the foreseeable future is to quantify care and then get that quantified number close to the true value of care, because the government resources are limited, so that they need to see that numbers to prioritize with other tasks. So.
And do you think that the current Canadian and global economy is going to help or decrease the efforts around protecting caregivers who are also in the workforce? I mean, shortage in the workforce right now, but also inflation. Do you think that is going to have a positive or negative impact on the issues?
Do you want to hear the optimistic answer, or the one that? Because I and also I feel like the truth is again somewhere like in the middle. And I mean, with a lot of the trends, especially with happening within family dynamics, yeah. So a lot of families are having their children at older ages. So that kind of pushes your trajectory to care and your availability of caregivers. So when you get older, you might need actual care. The children that are, presumed to be the ones who are going to step up and provide that care for you may not be at that age yet, or maybe still establishing themselves within their own lives. So that kind of pushes the needle further. And then we know that there is a heavy reliance on, the care provided by the state. We know home care, and we know what's happening in that industry. Like you can just turn on CBC and find out what's happening within the paid care work industry. So really understanding that the reliance is going to be thrust, if not already, on the families. And if we're not able to figure out how to make care sustainable in the home for people who we know are juggling 2-3 jobs at a time because of the economy, because of rising inflation, I don't want to, be the harbinger of bad news or what the potential dystopian future of a world that can't care for people will look like. But it's obviously concerning to us. Choong, I don't know if you have anything to add. That was pretty dour.
I think in general, I think we are already experiencing the labor shortage in Canada, specifically after the Corona-19 situation. We're experiencing the labor shortage across pretty much every industry, especially the high-tech industry. And so I think they're addressing this caregivers issue, balancing work and care, I think is also the part of that labor problem too. So I think I think we need to find the solution, but definitely this time I think we at least need to be aware that there is an issue that we need to address.
Thank you very much. There are more questions, but I will keep them for the general Q&A at the end. Because I would like to hear from our stakeholder, Marjorie Moulton, and I would like her to have enough time to provide her comments on everything she heard today. So let me introduce you to Marjorie. Marjorie is a dementia consultant at the We Rage, We Weep Dementia Consulting. Dr. Moulton is a resident of Victoria, BC. She began her career in allopathic medicine and psychology. A graduate of the International College of Traditional Chinese Medicine, Dr. Moulton earned her doctorate in Oriental medicine before personal experience caring for her father with Alzheimer turned her focus to dementia. Dr. Moulton has become well known for having been a personal caregiver to family members, as well as working professionally with hundreds of family, friends, and professional care partners. She's recognized in the older adult care field as an innovator, educator, and now a consultant. So clearly, she can comment on all of the issues we just heard about. Marjorie, it is your turn.
Thank you, Virginie, for that introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts and lived experience on this very important subject matter of financial wellness and employment. Obviously, my experience can best be sort of taken from the fact that I have been a caregiver several times throughout my life to family members. One of the most recent ones that really resonates, especially with the last presenters, was when my husband and I cared for my father-in-law, who lived with us for the last 2 years of his life. Both of us were working full-time at that time as well, so certainly understand the pressures and challenges of balancing work life and caring life. And it was very often a lot of scheduling and passing off care and care responsibilities between the two of us based on whatever we had going in any given day or week. We were both fortunate in our caregiving time that we were entrepreneurs, that we did have some flexibility in our work, that we did work from home often. So that was helpful. We did have some challenges as the cognitive and physical abilities of my father-in-law declined progressively in some of the cultural barriers we had because he was from a different cultural background. And so therefore language and culture were a barrier for us to find work and assistance of caregivers that were outside the family circle. So we did lean heavily on family as well in order to be able to continue to pursue our career goals, as well as keeping his best care as top of mind. So it can be interesting to sort of see how this caregiving balance plays out, because also what can happen too is it's a matter of perspective, and sometimes we as carers don't self-identify as being caregivers. We identify as being the son or the daughter-in-law, and that this care is part of the circle of life and supporting our loved ones as they age, much as they supported us as we grew up. So there is that sort of balance, and I think that was, spoken to throughout the presentations, that finding that balance of care and of paid work can be very challenging. And how do we address some of the issues around sort of supporting carers, especially as they continue to work, and how do employers engage with that and provide that support as well? We know that the first thing, of course, in addressing any issue or concern is to be aware that we have a problem in the first place, so that we can take steps to address that. And we do see in other parts of the world some experimentation around going to reduced work weeks, and some of those kinds of things. So some of those things may help in the balance. But I also think that one of the things that I've found is that when it comes to employers supporting those who are carers as well as their employees, it's important to accept your whole employee, that whole person, recognizing that person is not just employee number, XYZ, but that person is a whole individual with an entire life behind them and other responsibilities outside the number of hours they spend in the workplace. And so if we can somehow come to that realization that all of us are whole people and we have all the different aspects of our lives, that the better we can integrate and recognize and respect those, the better off everyone will be. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to share some of these thoughts. And I want to commend the presenters, the researchers, for all the work that they're doing in this important field. And all of this research can only help make for a more encouraging and hopeful future. So thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. Do you feel that, Marjorie, I would like to address the first question to you. How do you think caregivers could be more involved in research so we can raise awareness, but more than that, build solutions? Do you feel that there are enough opportunities to be involved in research? What could researchers do more to involve you and other caregivers?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because there's this saying out there, nothing about us without us. So if researchers and technology developers are working towards some of these solutions to involve caregivers early and often and throughout the whole trajectory of what it is that they're doing. And certainly AgeWell has been a big champion of that, and really pressing for involving caregivers, involving older adults in research, in technology solutions. And so I'm very proud to be part of AgeWell for that. I think the challenge with caregiving is, so often, as already has been spoken to, there's a lot of pressure, right, to juggle all these balls at once. And so to become involved in research maybe during the active component of caring is very, very challenging. And so I think that I might say that maybe for those who wish to carry on, as I have, and build, a career around some of my caregiving experiences, that can be maybe a better time to involve people with caregiving life experience, when they are no longer active caregivers perhaps, but they come with all that background to the table that they can share, but also with the time and the clear-headedness to be able to do that as well.
Thank you. To all the presenters, you have clearly presented in your research the involvement of caregivers or persons with cognitive disabilities or older adults. Do you want to comment on the methods, the processes you have used, the lessons learned on how to better involve the main stakeholders in your research? Maybe in the order you presented, starting with Kristina?
Yeah, so in our study, in this one particular, we interviewed people with early onset dementia or mild cognitive impairment. So they weren't as cognitively severe, but we have done other work with people with, say, Alzheimer's disease, including at the end of life. So I think my advice to anyone is don't think it's impossible to include these people. You may face challenges. So even in this study, we faced challenges where perhaps the person was not having the best day, or if we were doing the interview by phone, there was background noise that really distracted them and we had to do the interview over a series of times or be flexible. But I think it's worth at least trying and speaking to colleagues who've done that for potential strategies, etc.
Thank you. Golnaz, you're next.
So in my experience, there's a lot of research around the lack of accessibility and accommodations that are made for individuals with intellectual disabilities. So throughout my research project, we've made sure that from the get-go, from consent forms and recruitment letters, they're accessible. So they are understanding what it is that what is the project that they're participating in, and making sure that they are understanding and they know that they can withdraw their consent at any point. So that was the initial stage. Also, what we've done in my project is that my project is an inclusive research. So we have advisors with intellectual disabilities who have been involved in my research project at different stages. So one stage of my project that their participation and their help is valuable, extremely valuable. But one particular example that I have is for when I was creating my vignettes. So piloting my vignettes with my advisors. So receiving their feedback, their experience, and all of their feedback was extremely valuable because I was able to change my vignettes, like in terms of if there are the accessibility, words, fonts, even the content of my vignettes, how to make sure that how can I present it so that this it's easier for them to read if the content is relevant to their lived experiences. So they've played a significant role, like even including them throughout the research process, not just as participants, but as advisors or co-researchers. Is valuable, but definitely making accommodations even throughout the data collection is making sure that we accommodate them and the process is easy and their understanding. We create meaningful experience for them even participate in research project rather than being more like coercive or, so that's been my experience.
Thank you, Golnaz. Andrew and Choong.
I think from our experience, and very much to Marjorie's point, when we spoke to Wendy, that was a few years removed from the heat of caring for her parents and also managing that transition of her career. And she had a lot of time to reflect and think about things that she admits, even to us today, still is very much dominant in her thought process of what's meaningful to her, how she wants to spend her days, and what she sees kind of in the future for herself when she grows older. And I think especially when you're dealing with caregivers is you have to be really respectful of their time. Like they're already squeezing you in, if it's an interview, if it's a consult, if it's a focus group or whatever, into a day that has way less hours than they actually should have for them. And to be upfront with them. And I know as researchers, that's really difficult to be upfront because we all know what it's like to get to the end of an interview or a focus group or a consultation with a caregiver, and then them asking us, so what's next? What are you gonna do next? And do we sit there and do we explain what the research and policy cycle is actually like and let them know like, hey, this might make a difference in 8 to 15 years? But I find if you involve them a little bit more in the process, invite them to talks like this, keep them in your contact list and your emails so that the work that you're doing, you're sharing, they actually see a direct line to. If they see their name, if they see something that they said to you in research in a slide deck, in an infographic, in something that ended up in an email newsletter, a part of them will feel like, hey, that hour I gave them actually did something. I don't know if it helped every caregiver, but at least for me, my piece of my story is there and it can help me keep going a little bit. So.
We can't hear you, Choong. You're still on mute.
So for the method, we have run the survey analysis, which is a quantitative method. And it's useful to find the scale of caregiving or the scale of impact of caregiving. And for example, so we've identified there are 5.2 employee caregivers across Canada. But at the same time, there's a limitation of using quantitative method that, for example, there is no way of finding out the intensity of care, for example, by conducting quantitative. So in that regard, it's extremely valuable of working with stakeholders, such as the Wendy that we showed in the slide, to provide her personal experience, to get to know the intensity of personal challenges in providing care. So I think to make the research project better, I think it's extremely valuable to get involved the stakeholders into the project.
Thank you. I'd like to comment on what you said. What I hear from you is involving stakeholders makes research better, and I totally agree. But I think there is something else that we need to consider, which is involving stakeholders can make research more impactful if we share the ownership of the research, if the findings belong to the stakeholders, if we understand what in our findings is useful to them and can be used by stakeholders to raise awareness, to build solutions. I think that's where we get the best scenario and everybody wins from contributing to research. And I think as researchers, we are trained and asked to think first in terms of the quality of the research. We build the research question and the proposal around the best research possible, but we have to train ourselves to think from the get-go about the value for stakeholders. So throughout the process, they see the value to them, they feel engaged, and they stay engaged throughout the process. But that's my personal opinion on inclusive research. We have 10 minutes left max. There are still questions, and we won't have an opportunity to address all of the questions. To all the presenters, if you'd like to put your email address in the chat, so perhaps people can contact you directly with questions that might be appreciated by the audience. Maybe we should end on an optimistic note and think in terms of if we want to build solutions around financial wellness, employment, who do you think are the key stakeholders we should engage in the next steps? Have you identified the key players that you would like to involve, even if you have not yet succeeded at involving those key stakeholders? But who should we, at which door should we knock first? Maybe again, in the order of the presentation, Kristina, Golnaz, Andrew, and Choong, and we'll end with your final thoughts, Marjorie.
So I think it depends on the nature of the research. So in this case, our stakeholders or the technology we're developing is going to go back and it's going to be pilot tested with the people actually in the workplace. So I think it depends on the focus of your question. But I think at the end, diversity and having diverse groups within your subset population. So in our work of people with MCI and dementia, ensuring that we also have diversity within that in terms of workplace, culture, race, country of origin, etc.
Thank you. Golnaz?
In relation to my my research, I would say it's just again bringing back the findings and making sure that it leads to knowledge mobilization and raising awareness among different stakeholders. Because when it comes to abuse, it's not only one person or two people. There is a system. There is like an environment. There's a lot of factors that play a role. So even from like healthcare professionals' knowledge, it's important to understand their knowledge, all the way to all the like systematic levels, like the hierarchy, to make sure that what people know first, understand what they know, what they think about it. Can they assess it? Can they identify abuse? And how can we prevent it? How can we intervene if it happens? And to be able to put in place appropriate intervention strategies, support system, and with the goal of preventing it. I hope that answers your question, Virginie.
It's a complex question. I'm challenging you, but it's not your PhD defense yet, Golnaz.
Good to know.
Andrew and Choong, do you have ideas of the key stakeholders to engage next?
I think from a research perspective, what's really going to be important moving forward is to get, with the respect of their time and, their efforts to like participate in this kind of work, is to get employed caregivers in front of actual employers, because there's a noted stigma in the literature that employed caregivers will not really want to tell their own employers or their own supervisors and managers that they're a caregiver because of fear of negative repercussions. My career is going to get stalled. They're not going to give me this job. This contract's going to go to one of my other coworkers, or I'm just not going to get the hours that I need to work because they know I'm not really that reliable. But if you're able to get them in a place where they're able to completely disclose everything that's going on with their lives with employers on the other end, who can look with empathy at the other side and understand this could very much be an employee that I just don't know that's already in my organization, and then understand from them what it actually is like. And at the same time too, we know employers have caregiving responsibilities themselves. Like, they're not devoid of having to care for family members just because of their roles in upper management or as supervisors. And understanding that caregiving is a workplace issue at its core, and not just one that only one side of my workforce is actually experiencing, will then allow the entire workplace to come together to actually meet them and think about solutions that go just beyond like, hey, I can give you a couple extra hours off or a couple of days off, or, you know, we have to tailor these things one-to-one, because we know caregiving for one person isn't going to be the same for everybody else. But is that going to happen? Are we going to see that in our lifetimes? I hope. It might be easier to start that off with smaller, you know, businesses and organizations with fewer employees and a maybe more one-to-one relationship with employment and management. But, you know, we hope that that's kind of the progression that we see that happens, and the change that happens in the workplace first, you know.
Thank you.
I think the based on my the research experience, one of the limitations of working with national surveys, especially the general social survey, is that it excludes those people live in territories. So you'll find the many Statistics Canada, for example, the national surveys that excluding those people living in territories. I think the it needs to be more inclusive, definitely, in the future.
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much. I think the big city centric attitude of researchers has to be over.
Yeah.
Marjorie, I would like to let you make the final comments on to responding to my question, or any final comments that you would like to make.
Well, I think just looking at the chat, the question and answer box, there was one question that came up about, over the course of my consulting, have I seen any improvements? And I think that I can answer that question and maybe share my final thoughts all in one package. I do think that there has been, and I think that there's been improvement mainly in the openness and willingness to share across all sectors. So employers are starting to open up to employees, and vice versa. Researchers and technology developers are becoming more and more adept at engaging with and working with stakeholders like caregivers, like older adults. All of those conversations seem to be growing and deepening. And I think that if we're going to address some of the challenges ahead of us, that is something that has to happen. And I think really all of us as human beings want to feel connected. We want to feel that our predicament, whatever it might be, is understood and empathized with by others. And so by contributing, if we feel that we can eliminate some of that aloneness feeling, then I think that that's very powerful. And I think that that's really ultimately what all of us here and all of us out there in the audience are trying to do, is find that way to connect, to share our experience, to make the challenges that we face a little bit easier and our burden a little bit lighter.
I cannot conclude on a better note. So thank you very much to everybody for your presence today, so we could connect and share and feel that we are contributing together to improvement in financial wellness and employment. I hope you have a good rest of the day, and I encourage you to visit the EPIC conference website for registration and information for other talks or for the videos of this presentation and others when they get posted, which is, I don't know when. Thank you very much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of the day. Bye-bye.